The Buddha once said, "All conditioned things are impermanent." This simple yet profound teaching reminds us that everything in life, our relationships, our possessions, and even our own lives, are temporary. Yet, despite knowing this, death remains something we fear and avoid. We rarely talk about it, and when we do, it's often with a sense of dread. Why is that? Why do we fear death so much? Is it because we see it as the end, a loss, or a scary unknown? But what if death is not an end at all? What if instead it is simply another transition, just like the changing of the seasons? Think about how the seasons shift each year. Spring fades into summer, summer turns to autumn, and autumn leads into winter. None of these changes are the end of life. They are simply natural progressions. In the same way, death is not a final end, but a natural step in the cycle of life. The Buddha teaches us that by letting go of our fear and attachment to the self, we can embrace death as part of life's flow. Today, we will explore the Buddha's wisdom on impermanence, the nature of the self, and how we can use mindfulness and compassion to face death with peace and understanding. Number 1. The impermanence of life, Anicca. The Buddha's first core teaching is that all things are impermanent, Anicca. He explained that everything in life, including our very own lives, is in a constant state of flux. From the smallest of insects to the grandest of mountains, nothing is static. Everything is born, grows, changes, and eventually fades. The Buddha's wisdom teaches us that we must not resist this natural law of impermanence, but rather embrace it. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering, the Buddha said. This wisdom reveals to us that death, far from being an anomaly, is a natural part of the cycle of life. The fear of death often arises from our attachment to the belief that life should never change or end. We fear death because we wish for things to remain static, yet this belief is a source of suffering. When we accept the impermanence of all things, including our own lives, we begin to understand that death is inevitable. It is not an end, but a continuation of the cycle of existence. Just as the seasons change, death is simply another phase in the natural unfolding of life. When we deeply understand impermanence, we no longer view death as something to be feared, but as something to be accepted with grace. The Buddha teaches that it is our attachment to permanence that causes our suffering. When we let go of this attachment, we are free to embrace the natural rhythm of life, death, and rebirth. Number 2. Letting go of attachment, Anatta. One of the Buddha's most profound teachings is the doctrine of Anatta, the teaching of non-self. We often fear death because we identify strongly with our bodies, our identities, and our possessions. We believe that we are our thoughts, emotions, and experiences. Yet the Buddha taught that this belief in a permanent, unchanging self is an illusion. He compared the self to a water bubble or a lightning flash, fragile and fleeting. Just as a water bubble is fragile or a lightning flash is fleeting, so are the lives of human beings. By understanding that the self is not fixed, we can begin to let go of the attachment to our own existence. When we understand that what we call me is just a temporary collection of thoughts, emotions, and experiences, we begin to diminish the fear of death. After all, if there is no permanent self, there is nothing to lose. Our bodies are constantly changing, regenerating, and aging. The cells that made up our body 10 years ago are no longer the same as those we have today. So what is this self, that we are so afraid of losing. When we let go of the illusion of a permanent self, we can see that death is not the end of us, but simply the end of a temporary collection of elements. This insight frees us from the grip of fear. Number 3. Embracing the nature of death. Death, according to the Buddha, is not something to be feared. In fact, it is an opportunity for us to deeply reflect on the nature of life itself. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think we become." This profound teaching shows us that our mind shapes our experience of the world, and this includes our experience of death. Rather than fearing death, the Buddha encourages us to face it with wisdom and understanding. By recognizing that death is a natural part of life, we can live more consciously and meaningfully. The Buddha reminds us that death is not an external force to be resisted, but rather something that arises from within the natural cycle of existence. Fear of death comes from the mind, and as we learn to transform our relationship with the mind, we free ourselves from unnecessary suffering. Buddha's wisdom in facing death can inspire us to live fully. "Do not fear death," the Buddha said, "for death is not something to be feared. Fear arises from the mind, and that which we fear will pass away." When we embrace the impermanence of life, we stop worrying about the how and when of death. We stop fearing what we cannot control. Instead, we begin to live more deeply, appreciating each moment as a gift, knowing that it is fleeting and precious. Number 4. Meditation on death, Marana-sati. One of the most transformative practices in Buddhism is Marana-sati, the mindfulness of death. This practice encourages us to reflect on the reality of death regularly, not to increase our fear, but to normalize it and prepare ourselves for it. While the idea of contemplating death might sound morbid, it actually leads to a sense of peace and understanding. Buddha's wisdom in Marana-sati is simple yet powerful. Remember that you will die, and use that understanding to live a life of purpose. By regularly contemplating death, we become more aware of the fleeting nature of life. This awareness helps us focus on what truly matters: our relationships, our actions, and our inner peace. We stop wasting time on trivial worries or chasing after things that ultimately do not matter. Instead, we start living in alignment with our deepest values. Buddhist monks often meditate on death to cultivate serenity and acceptance. Rather than fearing it, they reflect on death as a natural part of the unfolding cycle of life. Through this practice, they come to live without fear, knowing that death is simply a transition. We too can cultivate this attitude by integrating Marana-sati into our daily practice. By reflecting on death, we prepare ourselves to meet it with clarity, wisdom, and peace. Number 5. Living with compassion and awareness, embracing the natural flow of life. One of the most profound and powerful ways to overcome the fear of death is by cultivating compassion. Fear of death is something many of us experience at some point in our lives. We might fear the unknown or be afraid of what happens after we pass away. The Buddha taught that this fear is often tied to our attachment to our own life and existence. We may feel that our life is ours to protect, and this attachment can make the thought of death overwhelming. However, when we approach life with compassion, both toward ourselves and others, we can begin to see that death is not just an isolated event, but part of the larger flow of life, something we all share. Buddha's teachings remind us of a simple but powerful phrase: may all beings be happy, may all beings be free from suffering. These words capture the heart of compassion. When we embrace compassion, we start to see life and death in a new light. Instead of viewing death as something to fear or avoid, we recognize that it is part of the natural cycle of existence. Just as we experience birth, growth, and change, death is a transition that everyone will go through. It is not an ending, but a step in the shared journey of life. This shift in perspective helps us see that death is not something to fear, but something that connects us all. In our everyday lives, we often focus on our differences, our accomplishments, our possessions, our identities. We might think of ourselves as separate from others, but when we embrace compassion, we begin to understand that we are all part of the same interconnected web of life. Death is not a solitary event. It is a transition that every living being must face. And when we let go of the illusion of separateness, we can approach death with greater understanding, peace, and acceptance. Another key aspect of compassion is that it helps us release our attachment to the things of this world, our material possessions, our achievements, and even our identities. We often place so much value on things that we can touch or see, like a nice home or a successful career. But when we practice compassion and mindfulness, we begin to realize that nothing is truly ours to hold on to forever. The things we have now, whether they are material or emotional, are temporary. We may enjoy them, but they do not define us. For example, think about a person who has spent years building a business. They might fear losing it, as it represents their identity and hard work. But through mindfulness and compassion, they can begin to understand that while the business is important, it does not define their worth. They can find peace in knowing that life changes and everything has its own natural course. By practicing mindfulness, we learn to appreciate the present moment without being afraid of what might come next. Compassion teaches us to live fully and lovingly, without clinging to the things that will eventually pass away. Death is not an enemy to fear, but a natural part of life's flow. It is a reminder that we are all part of something much bigger than ourselves, and that life, in all its forms, is a beautiful journey to be embraced with love and awareness. Number 6. Understanding the nature of rebirth, samsara. In Buddhism, there's a deep and powerful concept known as samsara, which refers to the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. It's the idea that life is a journey that keeps going, like a wheel that never stops turning. But this cycle is not something we should fear or resist. Instead, it teaches us that death is not the end of everything, but just a transition, a move from one form of existence to another. Imagine that when a tree loses its leaves in the fall, it looks like it's dying. But we know that those leaves will come back in the spring. This is how the cycle of life works in samsara. Death is not the end. It's a part of something much bigger. One of the most comforting parts of this teaching is that it helps us understand death as part of a natural process, something we don't need to be afraid of. In the Buddhist view, death is simply a change, not a final goodbye. It's like when we change clothes. We take off one outfit and put on another. This understanding can help us live with less fear, because we know that life continues in different forms. The Buddha, who taught these ideas thousands of years ago, shared a simple but profound wisdom. Just as a seed turns into a tree, so the life cycle continues, influenced by the actions of the past. Think about a tree in nature. It begins as a tiny seed, and over time, through care, growth, and changes in the environment, it becomes a big, strong tree. Every leaf, branch, and root is a result of the tree's past. The sunlight, the rain, and the earth. In the same way, our actions today create the conditions for our future experiences. To make it even clearer, let's consider a simple example. Imagine you're planting a garden. You have a choice. You can plant flowers, or you can plant weeds. If you carefully plant flowers, water them, and give them enough sunlight, you will eventually see beautiful blooms. But if you plant weeds and ignore them, they will overtake the garden and make it messy. In this way, our actions are like planting seeds. Every time we choose to act with kindness, compassion, or wisdom, we are planting seeds for a brighter future. If we act with anger, greed, or selfishness, we plant seeds for difficult times ahead. The law of karma, the idea that what we do in this life shapes our future, works just like this. The seeds we plant today will grow into the experiences we face tomorrow. This is where karma becomes so important. Karma is not some kind of punishment or reward. It's simply the natural law that says our actions have consequences. If you do something good, like helping someone in need, you create good karma. If you hurt someone, whether intentionally or not, that creates bad karma. Over time, this karma follows us and shapes our future experiences. Now, living with the awareness of karma gives us the power to live in a way that creates positive outcomes. By choosing to live a life filled with kindness, wisdom, and right action, we can ensure that when it's time for us to transition to another phase of life, whether that's through death or some other change, we can do so with peace and grace. Think of it like a student preparing for an exam. The more effort and focus you put into your studies, the more prepared you are to face the test when the time comes. The more we live with mindfulness and purpose, the easier it will be to face whatever life has in store for us. But living with purpose doesn't mean we're preparing only for death. It means we are living fully in the present. Living a life of purpose means acting with intention, choosing kindness over anger, patience over frustration, understanding over judgment. It's about being aware of how our actions impact ourselves and others. By living this way, we not only prepare for a peaceful death, but we also create a life that is full of meaning and growth. Remember, death is not something to fear, because it is simply a part of the natural cycle of life. The actions we take today, the choices we make, and the way we live all influence our future. By living with kindness, wisdom, and purpose, we create good karma that shapes our future experiences. Samsara teaches us that life continues, like the changing seasons, and the more we live with awareness, the more we can prepare for the next phase of our journey. So instead of living in fear of death, we can live in full awareness, embracing each moment as an opportunity to grow, learn, and transform. In conclusion, the Buddha's teachings offer us a profound path to overcome the fear of death. By understanding the impermanence of all things, letting go of attachment, and embracing the natural cycle of life, death, and rebirth, we can live with greater peace and serenity. Through mindfulness, meditation, and compassion, we learn to face death not as an end, but as a natural part of the unfolding of life. As the Buddha said, live as if you were to die tomorrow. Learn as if you were to live forever. This teaching encourages us to live fully, love deeply, and let go of the fear that limits our potential. When we accept that death is part of the cycle of existence, we can live with purpose, clarity, and peace. If this wisdom inspired you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please give this video a like, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting Buddhist teachings and helpful life insights. May you walk the path of wisdom, free from the fear of death, embracing life with gratitude and awareness.